An American farmer recently described the trade tariffs placed upon him as, quote, the ice cream on top of the cake of a perfect storm. That single quote signals a much deeper reality. A quiet reshuffling of global power is underway, where long-standing trade routes are being questioned and the very definition of a reliable partner is being rewritten. This analysis will provide a clear framework for this new reality by answering 3 critical questions. First, what are the precise internal fractures causing the American agricultural empire to crack? Second, how is Canada methodically positioning itself to fill the emerging trust vacuum? And finally, what does this shift mean for Canada's long-term sovereign advantage on the world stage? To understand how Canada can win, we must first dissect the precise reasons why the American agricultural empire is cracking from within. The cracks in that empire are not the result of a single event, but a perfect storm with 2 distinct fronts, one external, the other internal. The external shock came with brutal speed. In 2025, U.S. corn exports to China, once a primary destination, plunged by 99%. This was not a market fluctuation, it was a systemic decoupling. The analysis from RFD TV based on USDA data shows that broader U.S. agricultural exports to China collapsed by 54% in the first 8 months of that year alone, wiping out $7.4 billion in value. That external shock then reverberated inward, colliding with immense economic pressure already building on American farms. For the first time in years, they are making a strategic retreat. The USDA's own projections show corn plantings dropping sharply from a record 98.8 million acres in 2025 down to 94 million acres for 2026. This is not a choice driven by market optimism. It's a defensive move forced by collapsing margins and the vanishing of a cornerstone buyer. But the most damaging fissure isn't found in these numbers. It's a crisis of trust. Long-term partners began raising concerns that were once unthinkable, pointing to inconsistencies in moisture content, variations in grain quality, and pricing pressures from tariffs and rising transport costs. This is critical to understand because in global trade, perception often moves faster than reality. When the assumption of American reliability is no longer absolute, the entire system begins to reevaluate its options. So you have a collapse in a key market, a forced retreat in domestic production, and a growing cloud of doubt over the very consistency of the supply. The foundation of America's half-century of dominance isn't just cracked, it's being fundamentally questioned. This signals a much deeper change. If the world's largest supplier is no longer trading on trust, it begs the question, what is the new currency that global buyers are actually purchasing? More importantly, how is Canada positioning itself to become the primary seller of it? That new currency is reliability. While the American agricultural empire confronts the consequences of its own eroding trust, Canada is executing a quiet, deliberate counter-strategy. The core logic is simple. It bypasses a direct fight on volume and focuses instead on winning on trust. Think of it as 2 divergent paths unfolding in global trade. One is the path of complacent dominance, where historical scale is assumed to be a permanent advantage. The other is the path of strategic positioning, where reliability is cultivated as the core asset. What we're seeing now is that the world is willing to pay a premium for the second path. This strategy is not theoretical. It's actively redirecting billions of dollars. Canadian exporters are securing multi-billion-dollar agreements across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East with a sales pitch that explicitly emphasizes what the U.S. market is struggling to guarantee: supply chain consistency. The most telling evidence is happening right in North America. Canadian corn exports to Mexico have surged by nearly 50%, now surpassing $400 million. This isn't just new growth, it is a direct displacement of American supply as buyers choose the certainty of Canadian delivery over the volatility from their traditional partner. This trend isn't isolated. In Asia, the same pattern is visible. Japan, a key U.S. ally and trading partner, recently finalized agreements worth approximately $450 million with Canadian producers specifically to secure its supply chain. When a nation like Japan begins to diversify away from its primary economic partner for something as fundamental as food, it signals a profound realignment. Old loyalties are being superseded by the non-negotiable demand for dependability. What this demonstrates is the materialization of a reliability premium. Trade routes for decades drawn by cost and volume are now being redrawn by trust. This is the quiet power vacuum being filled, not with noise, but with consistent, verifiable delivery. We're seeing reliability become the new currency in agriculture. Beyond this, in what other industries have you personally witnessed a shift where trust and consistency are becoming more valuable than just size or cost? Share your industry's example in the comments. But this global reshuffling isn't a simple game of substitution. Markets are not interchangeable pieces. To understand the complexity, we need to look at a cautionary tale. A massive market the US thought it could easily win, and why it was a complete strategic miscalculation. That strategic miscalculation was India. From a distance, the American logic seemed sound. If a major buyer pulls back, you pivot to the next largest market. With a population of over 1.4 billion, India appeared to be the obvious candidate. This thinking was so prevalent, it became public, with officials like U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick openly criticizing India for what they framed as unfair trade practices for not buying American corn. This perspective, however, reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of the market on three distinct levels. It's a masterclass in failing to see the board for the pieces. First, India is not structurally a major corn importer. Its national policy has, for decades, prioritized agricultural self-sufficiency. It doesn't have a systemic need for vast quantities from abroad. The demand simply isn't there by design. Second, when India does import, its needs are minimal and its sourcing is regional. The 2024 data is unambiguous. Total imports were just under 1 million tons, sourced almost exclusively from non-GM suppliers like Myanmar and Ukraine. The American share was effectively zero, not as a political statement, but because it wasn't a logical or established trading partner for this specific commodity. But the third and most decisive factor is a complete regulatory incompatibility. This is the absolute wall that sheer economic power cannot breach. Nearly 94% of the entire American corn supply is genetically modified. India, under its stringent biosafety rules, has not approved these GM crops for import. Full stop. The two agricultural systems are, at a technical level, incompatible. The India case, therefore, is a profound cautionary tale. It is the definitive failure of simplistic, find a new buyer thinking. It signals that national sovereignty, expressed through policy and regulation, creates hard market realities that cannot be negotiated away by sheer scale. And this wasn't just a one-off miscalculation. It's a pattern. In fact, the United States made an almost identical strategic error nearly 50 years ago, and it led directly to the creation of its biggest, most enduring competitor. History isn't just rhyming, it's repeating, and the consequences are playing out right now. That mistake was made in 1973. It was a decision that, on the surface, seemed perfectly logical for a U.S. president to make. President Nixon was facing a surge in domestic food prices, and he needed to act decisively. The weapon he chose was a soybean embargo. The goal was simple: keep more soybeans at home to bring down costs for American consumers. The problem was that the United States' single largest customer, Japan, had built its entire food security strategy around the assumption of American reliability. The embargo wasn't just a commercial disruption, it was a profound strategic shock. In government offices in Tokyo, a realization dawned. Depending on a single, unpredictable supplier was a critical vulnerability. The trust that had underpinned decades of trade was broken, not by a hostile act, but by a simple act of domestic policy. And Japan's response was not to protest or negotiate for a better deal. Their response was systemic. Through their development agency, they identified a vast, underdeveloped savanna in Brazil called the Cerrado. They poured immense resources, capital, technology, expertise into transforming it. They weren't just buying soybeans. They were creating a new independent source from the ground up. Within a decade, as the data from the University of Illinois shows, Brazil had nearly tripled its soybean production. The United States, in trying to solve a short-term domestic problem, had inadvertently financed the creation of its largest and most permanent global competitor. Now, listen to how that exact same story is playing out today. The characters have changed, but the plot is identical. The new customer is China, burned by the same unreliability and political risk from the US. And China is now making the exact same move Japan made 50 years ago. Their state-backed firm, COFCO, is investing $285 million, not just to buy Brazilian crops, but to fundamentally expand the Port of Santos, building out the deep water infrastructure to accelerate and secure their own supply lines, completely independent of the US. History is not just rhyming. It's a direct copy. A powerful customer burned by American unpredictability is financing the infrastructure of America's key competitor to guarantee its own long-term security. So if the old rules of global trade, rules built on American dominance and predictability, are dead and a new game is emerging from the chaos, what do we call it? This isn't just random disruption, it's the birth of a new system with a new logic. And there is a name for this new grand strategy. A name that explains not just agriculture, but the entire reorganization of the geopolitical chessboard for the next generation is called Friendshoring. And it is arguably the most important strategic concept for understanding Canada's position in the world for the next 50 years. What this term describes is a fundamental rewiring of the global economy. For decades, the primary logic of supply chains was efficiency and cost. Today, the logic is security and trust. In an era defined by geopolitical friction and the memory of sudden disruptions, nations and corporations are deliberately rerouting their critical supply chains away from unpredictable actors and towards politically stable, rules-aligned partners. Reliability is no longer just a matter of logistics. It has become a measure of systemic and political alignment. To grasp this, think about building a team for a critical project with immense consequences. You could choose the most talented individual in the world who is also known for being erratic and unreliable. Or you could choose a partner you know, without question, will deliver on their commitments. For decades, global trade often gambled on the former. Today, it is decisively shifting its bet to the latter. That, on a planetary scale, is friendshoring. The recent analyses confirm this is not a theoretical trend. A 2025 commissioned paper for the International Agricultural Trade Research Consortium documents a clear pattern of friendshoring within agricultural trade, where smaller, more insular trading communities are forming around politically aligned partners in response to recent conflicts. On a macro level, the McKinsey Global Institute's 2025 Geometry of Global Trade update confirms a measurable pivot in U.S. trade concentration toward allies like Canada and Mexico, all part of a broader corporate strategy of de-risking. Now, friendshoring can sound like just another piece of abstract jargon from a policy report, but dismissing it is like trying to navigate the 21st century economy with a map from 1995. This isn't just about where we source components or sell commodities. This is about who holds the leverage to write the rules for the next generation. And this is precisely where Canada's quiet, systemic advantages finally enter the game. In this new world order, every nation has a reliability score, whether it's formally calculated or not. This score is based on its democratic stability, its respect for international law, and the low risk of it being subject to or enacting sudden politically motivated sanctions. And on this metric, Canada's structural advantages are immense. Our stable institutions, our deep-rooted commitment to a rules-based order, and our alignment within key alliances like the USMCA and NATO make us a safe harbor in a stormy world. This creates what can only be described as a geopolitical dividend. By simply being who we are, a reliable, stable, and predictable partner, Canada doesn't just gain incremental market share in sectors like agriculture. That's the symptom. The real prize is that we gain geopolitical relevance and durable leverage. We secure a seat at the table where the new architecture of global trade is being designed, not because of our size, but because of our character. But this strategic alignment, this role as a safe harbor, does more than just protect our place in the world. It pays a direct dividend back home, a dividend that enhances our own national autonomy and resilience. It's what I call the sovereignty dividend. And understanding what that is and how we can maximize it is the final piece of this strategic puzzle. So, what is this sovereignty dividend? It isn't a payment deposited into a government bank account. It is the direct conversion of short-term trade opportunities into long-term sovereign domestic capacity. It's the process of turning a market opening into a permanent national advantage. Sustained capture of this new market share is not the end goal. It's the catalyst. It is the necessary first step that sets a much larger, more important machine in motion. But let's be absolutely clear. This captured market share isn't the trophy. It is merely the down payment. The real prize, the long-term strategic win, is what we build with that revenue. It's the pivot from simply being a reliable supplier to funding the very technology that makes our entire nation more resilient. And that is where the real power lies. This virtuous cycle begins with economics. The increased revenue and crucially the predictability of long-term contracts provide Canadian farmers and agribusinesses the capital and confidence to invest, not just in more land, but in upgrading the entire technological backbone of Canadian agriculture. We're talking about a wave of investment into precision agriculture and climate-smart technologies. This isn't theoretical. The evidence is already emerging. A Reuters report from late 2025 noted that Canadian farmers using precision technologies like self-guiding tractors and variable rate fertilizer application achieved record crops despite extreme weather events. They saw on average a 4% increase in yield while simultaneously reducing fertilizer use by 7%. This is the definition of doing more with less. More broadly, economic analyses from groups like the Canadian Federation of Agriculture and Farm Credit Canada have all pointed to the same conclusion. While our national productivity growth has been sluggish, targeted innovation in precision and digital agriculture is the single most powerful key to reversing that trend, while also meeting our climate sustainability goals. This creates the virtuous cycle. The market gains from being reliable, fund the innovation. That innovation boosts productivity and makes our food system more resilient to shocks like drought or flood. This enhanced resilience, in turn, strengthens Canada's brand as the world's most reliable supplier, creating an almost unbeatable long-term competitive advantage. This is the sovereignty dividend in its final form. A nation that controls its food supply, owns its agricultural technology, and is therefore less vulnerable to external shocks, has gained true control over its own destiny. So, after examining the crisis in the market, the strategy for Canada, the historical precedent, and the long-term dividend, what is the one single principle that ties this entire strategic picture together? What has truly become the new currency of global power? Reliability. That is the new currency. The journey we've taken through this analysis began with a single commodity, American corn. We saw its dominance collapse, driven by a self-inflicted crisis of trust, a perfect storm that shattered the old system. Into that power vacuum, Canada didn't just sell grain, it sold certainty, a fundamentally different, more valuable product. This isn't a new phenomenon. As the Nixon shocks of 1973 taught an entire generation of buyers, market access can be severed overnight. History's echo is now the defining signal of our time, giving rise to a new global architecture, friendshoring. Supply chains are no longer drawn by the logic of pure efficiency, but by the lines of trust. For Canada, this strategic shift allows us to translate that trust into a tangible sovereignty dividend, funding our own technological independence and strengthening our national resilience. The lesson from the grain trade is therefore clear. Reliability is now the base layer of global power. The defining question for Canada's future is no longer if this is true, but where else, from critical minerals to digital infrastructure, must we apply this principle to guarantee our sovereign autonomy in an unreliable world?